Hello and welcome to this workshop webinar on supporting children with developmental challenges through puberty and adolescence. This webinar has been developed and recorded by the HSC Developmental and Autism Psychology Service in Carlow and Kilkenny. So before we begin, I'd like to run through a little bit of housekeeping. This webinar will last for approximately 30 to 45 minutes. You can pause the webinar at any stage if you would like to. The beginning of each new section is marked by a blue slide, such as the one you're looking at on the screen right now, and that might be a good place to pause if it's necessary to do so. Make sure that you have a pen and a paper to hand if you want to take down any notes or the names of any resources or any questions that you might have that you'd like to follow up with us on. And if you're having any technical difficulties watching this webinar, please contact the service in Bethany House if you live in the Carlow catchment area, or contact us in Kilcreen Children's Services if you live in the Kilkenny catchment area. So the outline of what we're going to go through today in this webinar, we're going to look at understanding puberty and adolescence. We're going to look at how these things can be experienced by children with different developmental challenges or different conditions. And we're going to look at supporting children in this area. We'll take a look at some useful resources and we'll go through some case examples as well. So just to acknowledge from the outset, this can be a very sensitive topic. It's not the easiest of topics to approach or to address with your child. And there is going to be an opportunity for you to consult with us after this webinar if you feel the need or if there are things that you'd like to go through specifically. So to start with understanding puberty and adolescence. So what is puberty? Puberty is when physical changes start in the body. Typically, this will start earlier in girls than in boys. So generally for girls, it's around about the ages somewhere between 8 and 11. For boys, slightly older, around 10 to 12, but that's very variable. And the timing and the rate of puberty is variable between different children and different young people. So adolescence then is the time following the beginning of puberty, and it ends when there is a transition to adulthood, and this end stage is also very variable. So there's lots of general information about puberty online, and I'm not going to go through general aspects of puberty in this webinar today, but if you're looking for more information about general puberty and books about adolescence, the series by Roby Harris is excellent and highly recommended. So that's Roby, R-O-B-I-E, Harris, H-A-R-R-I-S. So I'd highly recommend that for general information about puberty and adolescence. The books that are recommended in that area are in your pack in the resource list, so they'll be written there. So what are the hallmarks of adolescence? Adolescence is really a time of increased independence from parents, and that would include the process of decision making and learning how to do that and actually going ahead and making decisions for yourself. It's also a time where there is generally an increased influence from your peer group, so less influence from your family and more influenced by your peer group. It's also a time for searching for what your identity is and developing that identity. It can be a time in later adolescence of the beginnings of sexual relationships too. It can be about the time of work, a transition to work or college, and also it's the time for that transition into independent living where that's possible and appropriate. So adolescence is a time when appearance can become more important. There can be huge upheaval from hormones. There can be growth spurts, which can physically create different sensations in your body, as well as changes to your physical appearance, obviously. It can be a time where there's an increased need for hygiene procedures, and typically for many of our children, this can be an area of difficulty already. It can be a time when there are great changes and significant changes in social groupings and changes in your a child's peer group. There can be an increased pressure to fit in, or a perceived pressure to fit in can increase dramatically during adolescence. And if your child is in mainstream education, there can be quite a lot of changes in school structures at this time. There can be increased academic demands, increased responsibility, and sometimes less supervision as children grow older and go through adolescence. So understanding what the experience is like then for those with different developmental challenges. So for children who have different developmental conditions or different challenges such as autism or intellectual disabilities or things like that, puberty will still begin at the same time as their peers in the main sense. So there are certain specific conditions where that may not be the case, but generally speaking, puberty will begin at the same time as their peers, and we can expect for that to be the case. It's a time where a young person's interest in independence, their interest in romance, in sexuality related issues, and relationships is likely to be the same as that for their peers. However, it's also a time when that gap between their peers and themselves can widen if there are social differences. And it's time when friendships can be lost through either different peer structures, but also if your child is moving to a new school or changing school placement or things like that. And because of those factors, it can be a time where your child can miss out on some of those valuable learning experiences which they would have typically gotten through their peers and through contact with their peers. There can be difficulties with identity, including being different, and also a distinct lack of positive role models for children with different developmental conditions and different needs in different areas. So the tasks of adolescence can be delayed or they can be unmet because of that increased dependence on parents. Frustrations can arise because there can be a perceived sense of not being given the same privileges or independence as their siblings or as their friends that they might see. And there can be a sense that siblings might be overtaking them in terms of having boyfriends or girlfriends or partners, moving to college, developing their independence. So there can be frustrations and feelings around those sorts of things as well. So I'm going to go through 10 tips to support children with developmental conditions through puberty and adolescence. Tip number 1 is be prepared. Puberty and adolescence and everything that goes with it is going to happen. And there's very little, if anything, that can be really done realistically that's going to prevent that from happening. So it is happening, it is going to come, and the best way to tackle that is to be prepared. Tip number 2 is to start as early as you can. So even if your child is older and you're watching this webinar for the first time, it's never too late to start. The key message is to start. But if your child is younger, definitely start early if you can, especially if they struggle with change. So learning about puberty and adolescence, it can be slow, it can be confusing, and you're trying to change rules like things like where is it okay to get undressed during puberty, which can already be a difficult time for your child. And where you are trying to change those rules, that can cause a lot of unnecessary confusion and stress where you haven't worked on that before. So it's a good idea if you're starting early to think about if there's anything that your child is doing now that might seem cute and fun, but will be very inappropriate if they're still doing that when they're a teenager. And if that's the case, it's a good idea to start working on that now. Tip number 3 is to teach what might seem obvious. So most children learn what is often very confusing information about growing up and about sexuality from a wide variety of different places. So that can be from television, from the internet, from books, from friends, teachers, family, magazines, computer games, all sorts of different places. And for children with developmental differences or disabilities, they tend not to pick up all of this information, and what they do pick up, they can find it very difficult to decode it, to understand it, to process it, to know what it means and what to do with it. And for our children with these challenges, I suppose what they need is for things to be spelled out to them and for them in a very concrete way. So, for example, that it is not okay to ask someone out on a date repeatedly after they have said no. It's really important not to assume that because they can do things like list the rules of internet safety or tell you all about what the rules of dating are, that they will be able to use that information in real life. So real life practice is vitally important. Repeated role plays, practicing things out in the community, across different settings, all of that is really, really important to put what they know into practice and give them a chance to practice that. So this is an example of teaching something that might seem obvious. So for this young man, he was learning about asking a girl out on a date and what the steps were in that. So that might seem obvious to us or to others, but for him, he needed that spelled out explicitly. So other examples of teaching things that might seem obvious to others might be things like, teaching your child that when we're talking about a woman's eggs, that they're not hard like an egg, like a hen's egg would be, that it's not the same thing as that. Or teaching that you can't get pregnant just because you're sleeping beside somebody. So things like that might seem obvious but need more concrete, explicit teaching. Tip number 4 is to give information very clearly and very calmly. So adopt a positive and calm tone throughout when you're having conversations in relation to puberty and adolescence. It's really important not to overload your child with information or to have lots and lots of language around what you're trying to tell them. And I think, as we said at the very start of this webinar, this is a particularly sensitive topic. It's not the easiest one for many of us to address or to approach with our children. And when we're nervous or uncomfortable about something, lots of us tend to talk a lot and tend to add in lots of extra words and extra language. Try and be mindful of that and try and prepare in advance what you're going to say and how you're going to say it, if you can. So use things to help you with that. Use visuals. If you're already using visuals, use what's working well already. So if you're using photographs to communicate with your child or support their communication, use those to teach this as well. If you're using pictures or objects, use those to teach what's working well already. Be concrete in what you're saying. So remember what we said earlier about being careful to not be confusing in what we're saying, and use the correct terminology. It's really important not to use made up names that only your family might understand, but to use the correct words. Don't talk about things like the birds and the bees. If your child has very good language, it's a good idea to teach them the correct words when talking, or what the correct words are they should use when they're talking to teachers or to adults, but also teach them the slang words or the more common playground words that they'll hear their friends or their peer group talking about, and that it's okay to use those words when talking in that situation, but not with adults or with their teachers. So be concrete about those things. And then be very careful, as I said already, about being careful about language being taken very literally. So for example, boys' voices don't literally break, but some children might be quite frightened if they hear that being discussed. So tip number 5 is not to overprotect. So I suppose for us as parents, it is natural and very understandable that what we want to do is protect our children from any type of harm. However, our children and all children are vulnerable by virtue of their age. Children are a vulnerable group, but children with developmental challenges or particular areas of difficulty are even more vulnerable to abuse from others for a few different reasons. So firstly, they might have a difficulty interpreting what somebody else's motives are when they're approaching them. They might have a very strong desire to be accepted socially and therefore be more compliant or want to fit in and want to do things more readily. They might be uncertain about what a real friendship involves. And they might have difficulties reporting what's happened. They might not understand what's happened to them, or they might have difficulties with communication and being able to report something. So, as I said, it is a parent's natural instinct to want to protect their child, of course. However, in avoiding these topics around puberty, adolescence, sexuality, sex education, it can teach your child that these things are not important or that they're shameful. And it's really important to be aware that overprotecting our children leaves them much more vulnerable than teaching them about these things and exposing them to the different topics a little bit. So to reinforce this idea, in placing all of these protective things around our children, while we feel that we're protecting them from harm, what we're actually doing is creating a sort of a prison of protection. So we're protecting them from any sexual information, or protecting them from being able to make decisions, protecting them from society, and protecting them from relationships. We are shutting them off from learning about these things, which in fact increases their vulnerability. Much more so than if we support them with some of these things. So an alternative to a ring of protection would be a ring of safety, which also protects against the potential abuse that they might encounter from others. So this ring of safety would include things like education around sex and sexuality and relationships, awareness about privacy issues, teaching them the ability and the skill to say no, to not comply with things, having people in their circle who will listen to them and who will try to understand them, teaching them a good understanding of what their personal rights are and autonomy, teaching them about their health and their self-confidence, their self-esteem, and then looking at their different options for healthy sexuality and sexual expression. So all of those things being in place increases their protection against abuse from others, rather than putting that prison of protection around them and denying them access to those things. So moving on to tip number 6, which is all about teaching the difference between public and private. So this includes teaching about what is a public place, what's a private place, what body parts are public body parts and they're okay to show, what body parts are private body parts and they're not okay to show, what's a public conversation, what's okay to talk about in front of others, what's not okay, behaviors, and then also online information. What information is okay to put out there about ourselves and what information is not okay to put out there and what's private information. So teaching these things helps our children to behave in more appropriate ways and keeps them safer. It's a protective factor against any form of abuse. So be careful about hard and fast rules about public versus private, and remember to teach that rules can change over time and why that is. So for example, it can make sense to teach children that sex is a private topic only to be discussed with parents. But what if their peers are talking about it in the yard? So I suppose if your child has that rule that we only talk about this with parents, they might feel that they need to say to their peers, we should not be talking about this, or they might tell their teacher about that. And that can lead to a little bit of isolation for them, or increased isolation for them, if it alienates them from their peers. So there's a grayness around some of these rules, and it's important to reinforce that and teach that. So how do we teach the difference between public and private? There's lots of different things to help with that. So you can use your visuals again, make lots of posters, have sorting cards to help teach your children how to distinguish between what's a public place, what's a private place. You can use color coding in your home if you're trying to teach about appropriate rooms to engage in different behaviors and different things like that. So there's lots of different examples, and there'll be more in the resource list when we go through that later. So the next tip is about teaching how to say no, which is a really, really important skill to have. So, and the reason it's important is because if we teach our children to do everything that we tell them, we teach them that they have to do everything that everybody tells them. So perhaps a bully or a potential abuser, that they should do what they tell them to do as well. And I suppose, compliance from children is a highly valued thing within our education system, but it doesn't do anything to help with safety skills because of that reason, because we're teaching compliance. We're making it more likely that a child will comply with something that shouldn't be happening to them. So protecting yourself means knowing what your rights are, that your body belongs to you, that you have control over it, and what you do with it. And when a child says no to an abuser, it shows that they understand the rules of touching and sexual behaviour, and very importantly, that they are able to report it. So again, I suppose it's about teaching about their rights in this area in terms of saying no in a very visual format. You can use pictures again to help teach about this, and it's important to teach who it is okay, or what person is allowed to touch them. So for example, when you visit the doctor, there are times where that is okay and appropriate, and when is that not okay for other people to touch you, and to touch different parts of your body. So to teach the rules and the distinctions around that. So this is an example of a teaching resource for teaching this. So I'll just read this out. This is an example of a short social story in relation to this. So this was for a young woman, and it's about I can say no. I own my own body. Nobody can touch my body if I don't want them to. If I don't want someone to touch me, I will say no. I will keep my head up. I will use a loud and clear voice. I will not smile. I will try to look very serious. I will try to look them in the eye. I will put my palm up towards their face. So this is just one example of how you can use something like this to teach your young person the skill of saying no and how they go about doing that. But you can also use less language than this, if depending on your child's or your young person's level of ability or skill, or what supports they would need. And in addition to this on its own would not be enough. To go along with this, you're talking about repeated role play being very important, and giving them a chance to practice this. You could set up different situations with different people in their community in safe ways, where they could get a chance to practice doing this and distinguishing when they should do this or not. So with safe people in their community. So moving on to tip number 8, don't do anything for your child that they can do independently themselves, even if it means that this takes longer. And I suppose it's really important to acknowledge that this can be really, really difficult for us parents who might be under pressure to get everybody ready in the mornings, get everybody out on time, getting ourselves ready, and helping everybody to be on time. So it can be a really difficult one. But and it can be, as it says there, it can be an automatic thing that we do, where we make decisions and do things for our children in a very automatic way. But the issue with doing that continuously is that it results in our children being less able to do things or to make decisions for themselves. So the advice here would be to try and set up situations where your child can experience a little bit of success and push slightly against some of these boundaries. And it's difficult, but to try and make a little bit of time for that, or some situations over the course of the day where it's possible to do that, to fit that in. If you can, try and involve them in decisions about their lives, nothing about them without them, if that's appropriate, and try and give meaningful choices throughout the day. So where you can give a choice and you have time to support them in weighing up the pros and cons of the different choices, try and do that. So you could set up a wide range of different experiences from which your child can learn from. So even if they find that a little bit uncomfortable and it's out of their comfort zone at the start and they might need a bit of extra support, it's a really good idea to do that and give them practice at that in safe situations, so that they can then have that skill where it's really needed in other situations. If your child has an IEP, it's a really good idea to try and consider them being involved in the process and contributing to that. And all of this will also support a very positive sense of identity and create that positive self-esteem as well that we're looking for. Tip number 9 then is about helping your child to develop friendships where that is what they want and where they might be struggling with that. And I suppose friendships is the first or the early step in the ladder before developing deeper relationships or adult relationships or romantic relationships with partners. Friendship skills is sort of a bit of a precursor to that. So they will need a bit of practice at that if they are wanting to go on and have more adult relationships. So it's an important one to think about in terms of whether this is something that your child wants, or is this something that we want for them? So consider your own child and consider what they feel they would like to have. Do they want to have a big circle of friends? Are they happy with 1 or 2 friends? But don't always assume either that if they're avoiding social situations that means that they don't want friends or don't need friends. It doesn't necessarily mean that. It might be that they want friends but struggle to know how to, or to manage the skills that are needed for that. So it's really important in this tip to know your own child and know what's appropriate for them, and to not make assumptions about whether they do or don't want friends based on their behaviour, but to really tune into what they need. So if that is something that they would like to have, it's important to then, I suppose, support their social skills in that area and support them to manage development of friendships. So ways to do that would be to link them with other children who are similar to them or who have similar interests. And a good idea is to have a sort of a structured activity or an event where there's a common focus that they can socialize in that event, as opposed to a very unstructured play date type situation where it's very random. So having something to focus on or to engage in can really help to structure a socialization or a social interaction. And the internet can be really good for linking together with like-minded people, particularly where your child might have a very particular interest that not many other people are interested in. So it can be a good idea to think of that too. And the last tip then is number 10, helping your child or your young person to understand themselves is really important. So developing a healthy and realistic self-concept does mean understanding what your strengths are, what your weaknesses are, what the things you find challenging are. And it's really important for all of our children to learn that they are valuable human beings with valuable contributions to make to this world. And that's true for every single one of us, no matter what our level of strength is or things that we find challenging. So it's also within that it's important that at some point your child, your young person learns about their diagnosis and learns about the challenges that come with that diagnosis, what it is that they need to overcome those challenges, and how they go about getting what it is that they need. And I suppose it's important to acknowledge that that can be a challenge for us as parents in terms of talking to our child about what's going on for them and what their diagnosis might be. But it's important that we think about that from a self-advocacy point of view and a sense of them understanding themselves. So the way to start that piece, if it's something that you haven't done already, is to start talking about differences in the first instance before working up to talking more about what specifically might be going on for your own child or your young person. So there's lots of developmentally appropriate books and resources that you can use that will help support the conversations that you're having about what particularly is going on for your child. There's lots of different self-advocacy networks there. The Autism Self-Advocacy Network is named there, but there are lots of other ones as well. And you can also, I suppose, try and introduce your child through books, through TV, through the internet. If this is a really good thing to do, to different role models who might have the particular condition that your child has. If you are interested in learning more about that, we do have a workshop webinar on talking to your child about their diagnosis, and that takes you through a range of different role models with a wide range of different conditions that your child might have heard of or might have be aware of, and that can really go a long way to helping your child understand that the condition that they have does not mean that they cannot achieve different things, and they can just relate to it in a good way and in a positive way. So if you want more information about that other webinar, you can contact the service if you want to us to send that out to you, and you can watch that webinar as well. So moving on to some useful resources then. How best to go about teaching these different things that I've just been talking about. So it's really important to use whatever already works best for your child. So whatever you're already doing in terms of communication and helping them to learn different skills, those are the tools that you're going to use to teach these different concepts. So for examples, you can use visual schedules, different things like that. So for example, if you were trying to teach a showering schedule for hygiene reasons, you can use your visuals to help your child follow the different tasks that they need to do. You can use color coding for different behaviors to help your child understand the shades of different things that they're experiencing or the behaviors that they're engaging in, what's a good behavior, what's a not acceptable behavior, using color coding traffic light systems for those things. You can use rating scales to teach severity of different things or different behaviors that they might engage in, and teaching that there are different shades of feelings and different shades and different levels of feelings and severity. It's always important to try and reduce your language down as much as you can when using these different and teaching these different concepts. So these tools will help you to do that. Social stories is another tool that's really helpful, and we looked at one a moment ago when teaching that concept of saying no. That's an example of a social story. There are many others, and some of the books I'm going to recommend in a few slides. There are lots of social stories already done out in terms of all of the different concepts to do with sexuality, sex education, puberty, adolescence, all of the different things that we need to teach. And then consistency is the final piece to think about when you are teaching some of these concepts. So that's really important across different settings and across different people. If you've got more than one adult in the household, that you're both saying and teaching the same things. If your child is learning about periods at home and then they're going into school, that school are teaching the same concepts and the same messages, and that there's a sense of consistency across the different settings and different people. So this is just an example of a social story for teaching the concept of supporting a young man who is feeling aroused when seeing a girl on television, and what he can do in terms of dealing with that and managing that behaviour. So it goes through using some visuals, pairing those with the words, trying to help him understand some of the feelings that he might experience physically, but also emotionally, what the drives are. And then what he can do in terms of managing those feelings, what's appropriate, in this case, what's appropriate as opposed to what's not appropriate, but teaching that in a very concrete way and in a very appropriate way. For those of you whose children are using Boardmaker, this is an example of what some of the concepts will look like in Boardmaker, and some of these concepts would be for much older children, adolescents, young adults even. So depending on where your child is at and what stage they're at in terms of their learning and what's happening for them, this is just to give an idea of what that looks like. This is an example of a rating scale, and for this young man, he was learning about approaching girls and asking them on dates and things like that, and the severity of what is okay all the way up to what is against the law. So that rating scale of what is okay and what's not okay. So in terms of some recommended books and resources then, there is a lot out there. There is an information sheet, a recommendations sheet that would have gone with you with the link to this webinar. So hopefully you got that attachment, which has a list of books on general puberty and then recommended books and resources for more specific areas. So just to name a few on that, this first book that's listed here, Sexuality and Relationship Education for Children and Adolescents with Autism Spectrum Disorders, which is by Davida Hartman, is an excellent resource and takes you from the very early stages of teaching about gender and teaching about bodies all the way up to teaching about adult relationships and everything in between, in terms of sex education and relationships. And this book has all of the social stories done out for you, all of the visuals done out for you. It's a very practical book. We use it a lot in practice, and it's a very helpful guide. It's one that teachers can use as well. So I would strongly recommend that one. Just to say that although it is marketed at children or young people with autism, it would be absolutely appropriate for those without, both typically developing children and children with other conditions also, obviously depending on their level of language and that. But don't be put off by the autism piece if that's not the condition that your child has or experiences. The information in it would be just as appropriate for children without autism. The National Autistic Society is a UK website, but they have a lovely guide for parents on sex education. So I've just included the link there for that, and you can take a look at that. It's a nice, helpful and practical, good guide. And then the other book to recommend is a more recent one called Sex and Relationships Education for Young People and Adults with Intellectual Disabilities and Autism. So that's another good one. There's a few books about growing up which are really helpful. So there's this series by Kate Reynolds, which is about what's happening to Tom, what's happening to Ellie. So books about puberty and growing up for boys and for girls with autism and other related conditions then as well. So that's a good one. They're good ones to have. And then similarly, the growing up guides for boys and for girls. And these are by Davida Hartman, who wrote the previous book that we were talking about just a moment ago. So finally, just to go through a few case examples to give you an idea of how this all works in practice. So there's two here we're going to go through. So Mia is the first case example, so I'm just going to read this out. Mia is a 15-year-old girl with good verbal ability and autism who attends a mainstream school. Mia rarely speaks to the children in her class. On Valentine's Day, Mia sent a sexually explicit Valentine's Day card which she had bought to Peter, a boy in her class. Following an investigation by her teacher, it turned out that Mia had not been aware of the inappropriate content of the card. She had also misunderstood Valentine's Day, thinking that it was a day to ask a boy to be your friend. Mia stated that she had no romantic interest in Peter, that boys were generally loud and boring, but that Peter had Doctor Who badges on his bag, her current top special interest, and so she had deduced that he would make a good friend for her. So just to say that this is not a real case, it's just an example for an illustration for this webinar. So some sample strategies for this. So just to say at the outset that Mia has no interest in boys romantically currently is what she's saying. So therefore teaching her about dating and boyfriends and that isn't what's necessary for her. However, she does need support with understanding sexual language, socializing with her peers and making friends. So these are some suggested strategies around that. So firstly, teaching her about factual meanings of the sexual terminology and images that she has misunderstood, collaborating with her on social stories about friendship and talking to peers and what's appropriate and what's not, looking at a social script that she could use to ask Peter about his Doctor Who badges if that's what she wants to engage with him about. We could use video modeling about teaching her about conversations and how to accept or learning about accepting and rejection. Peer support. So one option would be to have Peter bring Peter in as a support piece on this, where he could be supported to deal appropriately and kindly with Mia's mistake, and that might involve him learning about autism, why Mia had made the mistake, and how it must feel for her not to have friends in class if that's what she wants to have in terms of having friends. And if he was willing, Peter could help to teach Mia the social skills and include her in some of the activities with his friends. And that might involve some role play with Peter and in approaching other children, and Peter giving some age appropriate but sensitive feedback to Mia. So working on that. Another idea would be that Mia could start a journal about feelings and friendships, which might help her to process through some of the pieces that she's not understanding or having difficulty understanding. And she might also like to investigate appropriate online Doctor Who fan discussion sites, obviously with support from her parents in terms of using the internet and that. But that might give her a sense of connection with more like-minded individuals who share that interest with her and broaden that socializing piece out a little bit. So to look at another example, case example, this time this is Tommy. And Tommy is an 18-year-old young man with Down syndrome and a moderate ID who attends a special school. Although it is a mixed-sex school, no girls attend in his age group. Recently, Tommy began rubbing his pubic area against a female staff as he walked by them in the hall. An intervention was started based on punishment, i.e. time out, and his daily chocolate bar being taken away. when he displayed the behaviour. However, during class one day, Tommy knocked his female teacher to the floor and began thrusting his pubic area into her leg. This was clearly distressing for the teacher involved, and Tommy was suspended from school with the possibility of expulsion. When his parents asked him why he had done it that night, Tommy said, "No girlfriend, never girlfriend." Again, this is a case example for illustration purposes only. This is not a real case. So some thoughts in relation to that. So Tommy is an 18-year-old man with very normal 18-year-old feelings and a right to intimacy. It is developmentally appropriate for him to want a girlfriend and to seek sexual experiences, although he was of course doing so in inappropriate ways and with inappropriate people. When Tommy first began displaying inappropriate behaviours with female staff, rather than focus on punishment alone, the adults around him needed to look at why Tommy did what he did and how it could have been prevented. So this brings up some questions for Tommy. Has he ever received sex education? What does having a girlfriend mean to him? What messages has he been given about having a girlfriend? Does he know that teachers cannot be girlfriends? Does he have any opportunities to meet appropriate girls? Is displaying this behaviour the only opportunity that Tommy has to touch another human being or to be touched? Does he know how to ask someone to be his girlfriend? Does he know the rules of appropriate touch? Does he display these behaviours in the home, for example with his sister or his sister's friends or out in the community? And does he have time and privacy at home in his own bedroom? So leading from that then to look at some sample strategies for Tommy, some suggestions around that. So in addition to some behavioural strategies to try and reduce inappropriate behaviours, so for example a token system leading to some rewards, it would be really important also to help Tommy develop his knowledge about sexual feelings, appropriate touch, girlfriends, etc., using highly visual materials, so supporting his understanding using visuals as well as verbal methods. And this can be done by making posters using colour coding for the parts of teachers' bodies that it is okay to touch. So, for example, it might be okay to touch somebody gently on the arm, and parts that it's not okay to touch. And teaching tactics as well to deal with sexual feelings in public would be important for Tommy. So for example, recognizing them, possibly squeezing a stress ball, showing a visual of Tommy's bedroom when he is aroused, etc. Teaching Tommy how to appropriately greet young women using social stories and role play would also be really important. And then after some intervention, trying to increase his participation in community activities where he might have an opportunity to meet appropriate young women that he might want to pursue friendships or relationships with. So we've come to the end of the webinar today. I hope you found this helpful and interesting, and I want to thank you for watching the full webinar. If you have any further questions or things that you would like to further discuss, there is going to be an opportunity to link with the service either through a Q&A session, or you're also welcome to come and ask us anything, to contact us by phone and we can respond in that way. Thank you again for your time.